The production of truly intelligent African children requires the existence of a very stable, yet dramatically creative, pervasive African centered consciousness in the African community. Therefore, it is of vital importance that the nurturers of African children, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles, and other caregivers and caretakers be assimilated into African culture and values. It's a quote by Amos Wilson. Welcome to our discussion on the African family, African personality development in America, African-centered and non-African-centered models. I am Dr. Slater Sarah. So this unit, we're going to talk about the idea of kinship and how kinship is significant or important to understanding traditional African social organizations and understanding African American relationships. So when we think of kinship, for example, or i.e. family, family is the basic unit of the kinship structure. Oftentimes, kinship structure includes relatives known simply as mother, father, sister, brother, so on. But in this idea of kinship, it provides identity, meaning, function, and purpose for the individual. In the African context, the kinship group was a comprehensive entity that continued through time, and it grew and expanded through marriage and childbirth. Marriage was never regarded as complete without procreation. In the work that we reviewed in chapter 3, we discussed Job's two cradle theory, and we found that based on African culture follows matrilineage, or the line of the mother. Majority of African culture follows matrilineage, or line of the mother. So kinship groups extend beyond the immediate family, but it is connected to extended family. Children then are taught through development through cognitive and physical stimulation. There are established community life cycle rituals, including things such as rites of passage, that allow for the child's social development. So it is through the controversy, the crafting, the look of the African family, that the structure of the African family in America has been disrupted and has some negative connotations. We have to understand first that you all should be aware of that the African family in America exists under the enormous weight of European psychological, cultural oppression and domination. The African family in America, post Ma'afa, is identified or looked at negatively. We have to understand first that where African people came from. So black folks came from Africa, right? And black folks came from, in Africa, very highly organized societies that included layers of social reality, social systems based on African cultural reality. It wasn't until African people were stolen and brought to the Americas that African people experienced this literal hell that their kinship was being forced into. And that family was subsequently separated on things like the auction block. So the psychological and cultural wounds that were created by the Ma'afa are cut very, very deep. And at this point, up until this point, no African-centered or Afrocentric interventions have been established to recover African people from the unnatural, abnormal conditions of the Ma'afa, which we know as the Great Disaster, a term coined by Marimba Ani, which emphasizes the enslavement, cultural encroachment of Eurasians on African continent and the subsequent enslavement of African people for 400 to 500 years. So the point of this chapter is to take a look at and answer the questions associated with what is the nature of the African family in America. In order to do that, we have to take into context the history of African families prior to enslavement and the impact of enslavement. Has it maintained its cultural form? And has the basic values of African culture within the family been maintained? Have there differences that are established in African life? What is the appropriate Afrocentric model of African parenting, specifically related to producing less culturally misoriented Black children? What is the appropriate Afrocentric model of parenting under contemporary African circumstances in American society? What is meant by African-centered child rearing, and what is currently wrong with child rearing in America? So we want to look at in this chapter how we correct the problems in African child rearing, and what does African Black psychology offer to African child development in America. So we're going to take a look at first the models of kinship and the models of African family in America. So we have theorists who looked at and would research a non-Afrocentric approach to understanding the African family, and in their approach, they often would utilize European worldview to interpret the structure of the family, the ideas of what behavior is supposed to look like. They did not include what we always utilize in the Afrocentric approach, extended kinship relationships. So the pseudo-Afrocentric or non-Afrocentric approach ultimately became an integrationist, Blackanized, Eurocentric view of the African family. So that also took away from the ability, based on Cambon's model, to understand, using a Eurocentric model, that African families come from a unique American creation. There's nowhere in the world that African people have established this trauma from disrupting the structure inside of the family to the struggles of extended or disrupted kinship. So the pure Eurocentric model views African family as coming from a subordinate cultural reality, while viewing the European cultural reality as universal and not culturally specific. So if we look at Afrocentric models of the African family, they focus on the adaptive and defensive functioning of the African family through its African cultural infrastructure, rather than proactive nation building maintenance functioning. So with these approaches, the idea, confusing, is that should say pseudo. These models address how African families have had to struggle through trauma, a disruptive nature, to maintain family structure. But a true Afrocentric look at the African family would include an African worldview framework. So we'll continue and pick up in the next mini lecture on African family, African personality development. No sneak peeks.